Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is Wednesday, the 22nd day of October in the year 2014, and it is a pleasure to be here with you today for our third time together this week. I don't know that we'll be able to top yesterday. For those of you who were with us, who were able to join us yesterday, Horst called early in the program from Taiwan, and we literally were on the until the very end of the program. It was one of the programs I probably have enjoyed the most. I told him, and I wasn't kidding, the only program that I enjoyed almost as much as yesterday was the last time that he called. So it was a wonderful conversation. I'd love to engage with him because he thinks so deeply and is so sensitive about many of the very same things that I think we all are. And I just thought it was absolutely a wonderful experience. I would love to hear from you. And again, it's a way to not hear my voice all the time here at the Virtual Center. So I do invite you to participate in our program by reacting. You don't have to obviously plan on talking for a full hour or anything like that, but just to offer your thoughts or your comments or your criticism or your questions or whatever, because you can be sure people say this all the time. It's one of those things that people say so often that it's probably devoid of real meaning. But the fact of the matter is that it isn't. And that is that if you have a question, you can bet your life that other people have the same question. Because it assumes that the question will be a good one. And the fact of the matter is they all are. And to be very honest, this is not a random sampling off the street. If you are listening to the Head On Radio Network, and you are listening to the programs on it, and you are as articulate and as concerned about some of the things that are happening in our society, in our world, then the questions and comments and ideas and thoughts and concerns that you have are important. And other people ought to hear them. And other people ought to have an opportunity to react to you rather than just react to me. So I would love to hear from you here at the Virtual Center. Our phone number, and it is a new one. This is the first week we've had it. And we found out yesterday when Horst called that it works beautifully. The connection was absolutely superb. It was flawless. And coming from Taiwan, to say that a conversation that lasted about an hour and 20 minutes was flawless is an unbelievable statement. Before I get off on that, let me give you the phone number. It's terrible to invite you to call and then not give you a number. Our number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. On your dial, 4676 is Horn, H-O-R-N. That's a good way to remember. It's a good way to remember it. So the only thing that you would really have to remember other than Horn is the 663 prefix. So again, 304-663-4676. If you would like to react one-on-one to issues in our conversation via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien906@gmail.com. what I was going to say before I gave you the phone number, and I was afraid that if I didn't give you the number, I'd neglect to. But this morning in class, in my class that meets 3 days a week, we're dealing with Madison's Federalist Number 10. And we were dealing with the age of James Madison. And specifically this morning, we were focusing on Madison's argument, or Madison's statement, if you will, as to how the Constitution of the United States was going to resolve many of the problems that Madison and other nationalists saw under the Articles of Confederation. And if you recall, in a letter that Madison wrote in April of '87, which is a month before the convention was due to meet, Madison sent out a paper that he wrote entitled The Vices of the American Political System. And in that paper, he listed a dozen flaws or faults or problems that he saw with under the Articles of Confederation that he would aim the Constitution of the United States at resolving. And so that document, that Vices document that Madison wrote in April of '87 is a critical lead-in, if you will, to the Constitutional Convention. Because the obvious connection is that Madison, in the Vices document, lays out the problems to be solved, and then in the Virginia Plan, which is Madison's initial draft of the Constitution, Madison addresses those problems with the kind of political system that he promotes or creates in the Constitution of the United States. Once students see that connection and see how the Constitution is in response to a series of problems which Madison identifies, then the structure of the Constitution itself becomes more meaningful. Anyway, that's kind of a lead-in, but that's not my major point. My major point was that about two-thirds of the way through the document, through Federalist Number 10, Madison addresses the issues of ways in which a republic is preferable to pure democracy. And what Madison points out very clearly is that pure democracy is based on the principle of majority rule. So consequently, his conclusion is that pure democracy is not the solution to the Confederation's problems. It is the cause. That in essence, what Madison is saying is that under the Articles of Confederation, with the states as being sovereign and the power in the state constitutions being based or focused in state legislatures, power is in that branch of government closest to the people. Therefore, it is more susceptible to majority rule control, to majority control, than government ever was before or ever has been since in this nation. And Madison says in Federalist Number 10, then, that pure democracy will not solve our problems. Pure democracy is the reason for our problems. And then he said, a republic offers the solutions that were the answers to the problems we're looking for. And then Madison explains, and I know, we've covered this before, so I'm probably, being repetitive here, and I apologize. But Madison points out that a republic has two advantages over a democracy. The first advantage is the delegation of power from the voter to the elected representatives. And secondly, the wide expanse of territory, the enlarged sphere idea of large congressional districts, which make it less likely that a majority will exist, or that a majority will be able to organize even if it does exist. And it's the inability of the majority to organize and to become operative that guarantees that power remains in the hands of the representatives. And the second advantage of the enlarged congressional district, the enlarged sphere, is that you eliminate from consideration in elections all of those who aren't well known in a much larger or wider area. In other words, if you need the election of a majority of the voters in a large, expansive district, chances are only those who are best known are going to have a chance to win. And so by definition, you pretty much guarantee that the people, the representatives that the people elect will be from among the best people, if you will. The most visible, the wealthiest, the most influential families, the most reputable people. And that is the House of Representatives, which is the people's branch of government under the Constitution. So Madison believes that you accomplish two very important things in a republic that you can't get in a democracy, and the result is political stability. The point that I wanted to make, and it's I think may not be worth the time that I've devoted to setting this issue up, is that Madison's whole idea of the enlarged sphere and its ability to work against the possibility of majority rule is gone as a result of technology today. The combination of the internet and cell phones, wireless communications, now make it possible to span huge differences in communication, huge distances. And I think our conversation yesterday from Taiwan is a perfect example of that. That was all I could think of yesterday was here I am in class talking about Madison's faith in distance as a way to keep the majority from organizing and, as Madison says in the document, executing its plans of oppression. James Madison is referring to majority rule as oppression because it works against what he feels is the public good and against the rights of other individual citizens. The fact of the matter is, if you think about it, if the majority is not able to rule, then the minority will rule. Somebody's going to rule. Somebody's going to make decisions. If it's not the majority, then by definition it must be the minority. And I think that's significant. But most significant, in reference to Horst's call from Taiwan yesterday, is the idea of how the security factor that Madison built in to the Constitution of the United States is no longer operative because of today's technology. And I think the call from Taiwan kind of confirms that. If you watch the news on television, we are seeing revolutions occur right before our eyes on the evening news. Revolutions that are made possible with cell phones. And instant, long-distance communication that causes things to happen in a variety of different places simultaneously allows a movement to function as a movement. And basically, I would argue, and I know I've said this before, but I really do think it's important. I think all the checks and all the balances that Madison built into our constitutional system in this country are at risk because of contemporary communications. I think we're seeing that in the elections. I think we're seeing that with Citizens United. We are seeing the amount of money from outside sources pouring into states. I heard a story yesterday. This is just an example, but I was told this by a friend, and I have no reason to believe that this is not accurate. But my friend was telling me that he saw a report that in the latest polling in the state of Kentucky, the Democrat, Grimes, was polling 2 points ahead of Mitch McConnell. And the very next day, $20 million arrived in the McConnell coffers for advertising in the state of Kentucky. In other words, instantaneously, $20 million was added to the McConnell campaign in the last 2 weeks of the election. I think it suggests that all the protections and all the safety valves that Madison believed different distance could provide for us are no more. And I think it's very, very significant. Consequently, I believe that we are going to have to sit down and do some serious head scratching and some serious reform thinking in order to find a way to discover new checks in order to preserve the political stability of this nation, within this nation. We have got to do it. And what concerns me the most at this point is that the political climate in this nation is not conducive to that task now. We are too divided. Partisanship is too sharp and too strong. When you witness in the election campaign, for example, that political candidates are trying to make political hay out of the Ebola situation, it's pretty obvious that candidates will use anything in order to win the election. And if winning the election means to instill fear into the people, then the Ebola situation, as well as ISIS, becomes a perfect way to gain election by attacking incumbents, whether in fact it's a valid attack or not. I think in that kind of a political environment that is colored by the kind of volatility and hostility and distrust and cynicism that exists in our nation, this is not the time for people to sit down and reason together. But the fact of the matter is, we have got to do it. We really don't have the luxury of all that much time. We are seeing political regimes that appeared to be somewhat stable. We are seeing them fall around the world. And as often as not, there's nothing to replace them but chaos. And the world is paying the price for that chaos. So I really believe that the issues that we're dealing with here at the Virtual Center are quite significant. And I think that I believe that Horst, in his conversation yesterday, is making major contributions to the kind of conversation and the kind of thinking that is conducive to addressing and solving some of these issues. During our conversation yesterday, Horst and I got into the issue of education and the issue of education reform. And Horst made the point that in many cases our education system has been hijacked, sabotaged. I believe sabotage was the word. And I thought about that last evening because I knew that today we were going to be dealing with issues related to education generally, to history education most specifically, with the idea of the founders and the intent and the meaning of the founders, because I think it's a critical issue here for all of us in and around the virtual center. I think it's a critical issue for the nation as a whole. And the issue of sabotage of our education system. If you are to accept the idea of sabotage, then you obviously believe that education ought to be something different than it is. You believe in the vision or the assumptions of a well-educated citizenry as the basis of success in Republican government. And I think we've touched on this so many times here at the Virtual Center. The extent to which an educated citizenry is vital to the positive operation of our republic. And then we get into the question of what we mean by educated citizenry. And this is where we get into trouble. Because what some people believe constitutes educated citizenry, other people do not. And I happen to be one of those people that do not. I believe I have to be honest as I look in the mirror, so to speak, and I must realize and acknowledge that I am an idealist. I believe in the idea and the necessity of an educated citizenry. But I also believe that everybody can be educated well beyond the level at which their education is currently functioning. I think that we are, I was going to say intentionally, selling students short. But in a lot of cases, I don't know that it's intentional, because I don't think that people recognize that there's any other possibility. I grew up in a period, and I know many of you listening did the same thing. I grew up in a period in which the operative idea behind education and schooling was that one's education ought to be tailored, excuse me, ought to be tailored to the skills and the needs of students. In other words, the ideal, and this was John Dewey, and John Dewey was a progressive in education, but he felt that schools ought to become laboratories of the society at large, and that depending on the role that one anticipated playing in that society, that would determine the level and the kind of education that you ought to receive. And that in a democratic society, society's responsibility was to make education available that is tailored to the needs and abilities and talents and wants and vision, if you will, of the individual student. The idea being that democracy in the field of education was the ability to choose the kind of education. So those people who wanted to go into more technical fields, for example, would not be subjected to a classical education. And those people that wanted to go into the classics wouldn't be subjected to a vocational type of education. The idea is that if quality education in all of those different areas is available to everybody, then you are fulfilling the ingredients or the requirements of a democratic system. If you accept that, if you believe that, and for many, many years I did, then you would be very comfortable with Thomas Jefferson's approach to education in his General Diffusion of Knowledge bill, piece of legislation in Virginia, because clearly Jefferson believed that it was a waste of time to expose high-quality cognitive thinking skills in an education for the masses. Because Jefferson was assuming that the masses of the people didn't need it, didn't want it, couldn't handle it. But Jefferson, to his credit, also realized that despite the fact that many people didn't want to believe this, all intelligence and all talent and all brain power was not within the ranks of the wealthy. That there was intelligence and brain power within the context, within the confines of the poorest of society. So therefore, Jefferson's educational system would be so structured that through competition, the cream of ability would rise to the top. And that's almost a direct quote from Jefferson. Periodic skimmings of the cream of ability, he called it. And annually selecting the boy of best genius from each school and pushing that student further at public expense, thereby making all of society the beneficiary of the talents of all of its citizens. In other words, what better thing could one do for his community, for his nation, for his state, than to undertake a strategy which reveals the boy of best genius and allows society to support that child's education beyond everybody else's. The everybody else, of course, is the majority of the students, all but the boy of best genius. There are those people who will argue that Jefferson's strategy really has a negative influence on the poor as well, because rather than opening up opportunity through competition for everybody to be the boy of best genius, Jefferson's plan would also allow society to cherry-pick the most ability and the most talent out of the ranks of the poor, thereby rendering the poor elements of society leaderless. That what you are basically doing is finding a way to extract potential leadership from the ranks of society where you don't want any leadership to exist. That's a rather negative view of Jefferson's proposal, but on the other hand, I think it's a valid and a real one. There's no question then that the kind of education that Jefferson is focusing on is the kind of education that the masses of youngsters would get in the 3 years during which every child, rich and poor alike, would go to school gratis at no expense. And if parents wanted their child to go on further, if they could pay for it, they could have it. So with the exception of the boy of best genius, who would continue to be subsidized by the state, education for most students stopped at 3 years. So then the issue becomes, how much can a person learn in the first 3 years of schooling as a young child? Is it possibly enough to constitute the ingredients of what we call an educated citizenry? Or in fact, does it merely focus on the basic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic in order to make it possible for those who have something to teach to reach the students who have something to learn? In other words, are you just teaching the masses enough to be able to communicate with them and to be able to teach them morality, ethical behavior, the values of hard work and honesty and cleanliness and patriotism and many of the other things that you want them to learn? Treating other people as you would have them treat you, the golden rule, and those kinds of things. In other words, in order to be able to teach everybody those important values, you've got to have an education system. But to be realistic about it, in 3 years, that's about all you could accomplish. So the question that one is confronted with, is that all that those who have been operating or making decisions in our education system since, is that all they ever wanted our schools to accomplish? And the irony is, if your answer to that is a yes, then it seems to me we have to rethink the whole idea that our education system is failing, because if that's what it's intended to do, then it's not failing at all. It's immensely successful. As we are seeing in our current election, the fact that the heavy hitters financially, the Koch brothers and other groups who are pouring money in obscene amounts into our political campaigns, are doing so because they believe and they know that it works. And if they were dealing with what we call an educated citizenry in the ideal situation, then money wouldn't work. If we were dealing with a voting public that was really educated and had been educated in critical cognitive thinking and skills, whose reading skills were better, whose analytic skills were sharpened, whose ability to do research and to collect information and to recognize the important things from the unimportant things in our campaigns, then all the money in the world wouldn't help to persuade educated people who can think and know for themselves. I'm an idealist. I believe that that's the level of education that we have to aim for. I'm not alone. There are a lot of people who agree with me and agree with that kind of an education system. But the reality is that there are a lot of people who don't. And there are a lot of people who are afraid of an educated, thinking citizenry. And I think that fact surfaces over and over again in debates during reform periods in our educational system. Over the last couple of years, we've been dealing with a major reform in our K through 12 education system, and that's the Common Core standards. And we know that opposition to the Common Core has grown rapidly in this country as those opposed to those kinds of standards are able to organize and to commit resources into opposing them. Many of the states that during the initial rush of enthusiasm for the Common Core standards adopted the program, on second thought have tried to unadopt the Common Core. And we spent a lot of time here at the Virtual Center in previous months looking at the issue of the Common Core and who's opposed to it and why. And one of the things and again, I'm just drawing general conclusions here at this point. One of the things that I think becomes most obvious is that much of the concern about the Common Core is not focused on the substance of the Common Core at all. That most of the opposition, it probably is wrong to say most, much of the opposition focuses around where the Common Core came from, who developed them, where the money came from to promote them, which is obviously the Gates Foundation being a major one. And because of who supports them and who developed them and who's funding their approval and their implementation, that has become the basis for an awful lot of the arguments and position papers against the Common Core. Very rarely does the opposition to the Common Core focus on the Common Core itself, on the substance. What I would like all of us to think a little bit about is that substance. What is there in the Common Core that might really change the game in the way we educate the vast majority of our citizens? I think the answer to that question gets us to the substance of the Common Core. And once we get there, and we begin to look at the specific learning objectives associated with the Common Core, we begin to see that many of the skills that are inherent in these new standards are skills that have been denied the masses in our school system for generations. If you look at the learning objectives, it doesn't matter what level you're talking about. 4th grade, 8th grade, 11th grade, I've looked at them all. And what you begin to see is that students are being asked to perform cognitive functions, activities, thinking activities that they have never been asked before to do in school, in an educational setting. They are not new activities to education. They've always been there for the education of the few. But never were they considered to be the basic ingredients for education of the many. The ability to analyze, the ability to speculate on alternatives to information. This is what happened. Let's speculate on some of the things that might have occurred other than what did occur. And students are being asked to do things with information, to internalize information, to engage it, to speculate about it, to make determinations about it, to begin to rank information and issues on the basis of importance, and saying every fact is not equally as important as every other fact. That if you can properly organize information into major and minor categories, you can begin to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. Education becomes much more manageable because every fact in and of itself is not equally potentially important. Rather, you can isolate on the major themes and the major issues. And then you can organize the supporting information that produces and leads to those particular most important issues. And then you can ask students to rank them. But not only rank them in terms of importance, but explain why you ranked them the way you did. Or even better, argue for your ranking as opposed to someone else's ranking. Why is my ranking more valid than yours? And ask students to engage in that argument. In other words, to put together argumentation in support of decisions that they make What we are talking about is the ingredients of cognitive thinking, of abstract thinking, of synthesis, an ability to see themes and see commonalities, rather than just look at every piece of information as totally separate and totally isolated from every other piece of information, which renders the student able only to memorize in order to learn that information. That becomes the model for teaching the masses. It has always been that model, and it continues to be that model. The Common Core proposes to change it. And it is instilling and initiating an awful lot of opposition. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the opposition is tangential to the issue. In other words, a lot of the information doesn't directly pertain to the Common Core standards themselves, but rather it's an attack on Gates or attack on big money or an attack on corporate America, and basically raising the question with citizens, why does corporate America want the Common Core standards? What's in it for them? And what they're talking about is that the Common Core standards emphasize thinking and workplace skills. And what corporations are after is better trained workers. And that what we're basically setting ourselves up for is educating a nation of workers rather than a nation of thinkers. So therefore, these people become opponents to the Common Core. But once you understand what the Common Core consists of, what it is asking of teachers and students, you can begin to see that the Common Core promises, and I emphasize that word, it doesn't deliver change in the way we do education. It promises the possibility of change, provided that teachers follow through with these new standards and actually implement them. So the potential for a level of education for the masses that was never there before is there now. And I think we have to begin to recognize that in order to understand why so many people are so opposed to those standards. We are talking major issues here. We are talking about the question of an educated citizenry. We are talking about the possibility of jobs, meaningful, challenging, well-paying jobs. We are talking about economic development and growth. We're talking about individual opportunities for citizens. We are talking about dignity that is associated with work and self-support. We are not talking about a society which continues to keep a significant element of our population at a minimum wage level, which makes people who work 40 hours a week eligible for food stamps and supplemental income and charitable health care and all the rest of it. That, I would suggest to you, ought to be a black mark on society. It's a disgrace. And we can do better. And we must get about doing better. And that doesn't mean adopting the Common Core in and of itself is not going to produce positive results. Because what we're going to have to do is engage in a major retooling of the way we prepare our teachers. We're going to begin to ask our teachers to do things in their classrooms that they never before ever experienced in their lives as students, at any level, even college. So I think that this issue is so important in so many different ways to the issues we're dealing with here at the Virtual Center. I mentioned yesterday in the conversation with Horst that the emphasis on the Common Core over the last month, 6 weeks or so, seems to have shifted. And now the focus of attention in the field of education seems to be devolving around the issue of the advanced placement exams in American history. Once again, we're back to the way we teach our young people about their past, about the founders. And there's a tremendous debate that has surfaced in recent weeks over a new set of standards, a new framework, if you will, for advanced placement. Now, it's important for us to keep in mind what we're talking about here. When we're talking about advanced placement, we're not talking about the education of the masses of students. We are talking about the brightest students. And when we talk about advanced placement classes, we're talking about high school, juniors and seniors. So what we are talking about are the brightest students in our high schools, and the way they will be taught about the past and the way they will be tested on their knowledge of and ability to understand the history of this nation. And the irony is, this seems to me to get right down to the nitty-gritty as to what the opposition to the Common Core is all about. Because it's very obvious that the same people that were opposed to the Common Core have now shifted the focus of attack to these new standards. And in opposing the new framework for the AP American History exam and attacking the College Board, which the College Board actually directs the advanced placement program in our high schools, then the attention has shifted to the brightest students that we are graduating from our schools, the students who traditionally take advanced placement classes in a variety of different areas. But the area that's getting most of the attention, obviously, is AP, is United States History AP. And that's where I'd like us to put our attention for the rest of our time together this week here at the Virtual Center, is on this issue and on the new framework and on the basis of concerns about the new framework. What I would like to do is I would like to begin by acquainting all of us, myself included, with the new framework. What is it? What is the change that is being reflected in the advanced placement exams? And then taking a look at the criticism of those changes. It is ironic. This isn't ironic at all. That's not the correct word. I misspoke. It is fully to be expected that a major publication where criticism of this new framework, this new AP program, would be most vocal and strongest would be in the National Review, which is the conservative publication in this country. The magazine begun in the early 1960s by William Buckley. Let me, if I can, we are at 49 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 10 minutes before we take our break. What I'd like to do is introduce to you an excerpt from a report entitled the La Pietra Report, a report to the profession written by the Organization of American Historians on the issue of internationalizing the study of American history. One of the major criticisms of this new framework is because the new framework evolved from this La Pietra report. The term La Pietra is because of a villa in Italy where historians met in order to draft the ingredients of this new framework. They were not only American historians, they were historians from other nations around the world. One of the major criticisms then of the product is that we are allowing historians in other nations to play a role in how we educate our young people on the history of our own nation. So we are at kind of a contradictory situation here, because there's no question that those who argue that America is an exceptional nation, in other words, those who advocate American exceptionalism, do so because of the influence they expect America to have on the rest of the world. But now those very same people are criticizing a reform process which allows those people from the other parts of the world some say in how we educate our own citizens in the history of our nation. In a sense, what the critics are advocating, if you will, is that American students be educated within the confines of America as if it was the only nation on the face of the earth. Even though once they are educated, they will recognize that America's role in the world is unlike that of any other nation. But their education is never to reflect that fact. That to me is the basis. So with that introduction then, let me introduce you to part 2 of the La Pietra report, which is written by a substantial number of historians, prominent historians from this country as well as historians from abroad. One of the criticisms is that one of the historians on the panel is from Havana, Cuba. The absolute shock, for example, of having a Cuban historian react or have input into the way we educate American youngsters in our public schools. I think you begin to get a sense already as to what this is about. So with that, let me at least begin, and we can finish this after we take our break at the top of the hour. Let me begin by just sharing with you this section entitled Rethinking American History in a Global Age. This is a quote. History is a contextualizing discipline. It explains social change by reference to temporal and spatial contexts. You can tell that this is written by academics for academics. Because if you give that sentence to a class of our students, they wouldn't have any idea what temporal and spatial contexts means. Space and time. Back to the text. Since the professionalization of the discipline, history as a profession, as a discipline, since the professionalization of the discipline in the 19th century, the nation has been treated as both the principal object and the context for historical inquiry. Study of the United States offers no exception to this generalization. Its historiography may even offer a particularly strong example of this approach. So what that first paragraph is saying is that the study of history traditionally in this country has not taken cognizance of the fact that we exist in a world of other nations and other peoples. The way we teach history pretty much has ignored that. At present, however, intellectual trends in the general culture are pointing in a different direction. Recent discussion of globalization, for example, may be uninformed by history, but they have nonetheless promoted important thinking about the historicity of the nation itself. In other words, because of the emphasis on globalization, the technological revolution, the communication revolution, the internet, the idea of the world as being flat, Thomas Friedman's very famous book. The result is that the deficiencies in the way we teach history have become more and more evident as more and more attention has been paid to the global nature of issues. These new understandings of the nation state invite more complex understandings of the American nation's relation to a world that is at once self-consciously global and highly pluralized. So what they are basically suggesting is that we need to reform the way we teach history in order to get with the realities of the modern world. We cannot have so much emphasis on the global nature of the economy and issues related to the environment and issues related to climate and all of these things which pose global challenges, while we continue to teach the history of our nation to our own youngsters as if there was no world out there, and that everything important was confined within the borders of the United States of America. We can't continue to do that, seems to be the operative assumption of this group. If historians have often treated the nation as self-contained and undifferentiated, it is increasingly clear that this assumption is true in neither the present nor the past. A history that recognizes the historicity of different forms of solidarity and the historical character of the project of nation-making promises to better prepare students and the public to understand and to be effective in the world we live in and the world we will live in. A more limited history, one insensitive to a multiplicity of contexts and scales of experience, would be a partial and inadequate history, telling far less than the history of the United States. We would be doing a disservice to our nation and to our citizens if we continue to perpetrate this illusion that the United States exists in a vacuum and is not part of a much wider global environment. Not all historically significant forms of power are coterminous with nations. Historical inquiry must be more sensitive to the relevance of historical processes larger than the nation. Under the inspiration of social history, historians have in the past generation become aware of the importance of solidarities and processes smaller than the nation. Now we must extend our analysis to those histories, to incorporate an awareness of larger transnational contexts, processes, and identities. Many contemporary theories converge with this project, but it is not motivated by theoretical considerations. Its inspiration is empirical, the quest for truth, for verisimilitude, which is a new truth. This approach builds upon comparative history, a method of historical inquiry that has been developed by Americanists in the past generation. Yet what we propose here is a different project. Rather than comparing two national experiences, it relates national experiences to larger processes and local resolutions. The approach of this project is closer to and extends recent work in the study of the African diaspora, the creation of the Atlantic world, diplomatic history, the history of migration, environmental history, the study of gender, and intellectual history. One could extend the list of examples. Economic history, for example, is vital to this work, yet in recent years the number of its practitioners has declined. We hope that the historiography we propose will prompt renewed engagement with such essential fields and encourage work in some of the newer fields just mentioned. But our point here is to call attention to the evidence of an emerging trend in historiography. This developing work, which we seek to advance, promises to enhance our capacity to explain past and present social change. And I think that's probably a good place to stop. It is the top of the hour. It's 1 minute after the hour, 1 minute after 2 in the East. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. And our topic today is the contemporary education of our citizens in the contemporary world and what changes the improvement of that education must necessitate. Please stay with us. We'll be back for yet another hour. We'll take a short break, 4 or 5 minute break, and we'll be right back here at the Virtual Center. Please stay tuned.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Thank you for the selection of music. It was wonderful. I very, very much enjoyed it. It's a change. It's quite a change from some of the music we've had in the past, and the variety of music that you select for these breaks is quite good, and you're to be congratulated for that. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're in the second hour of our 2-hour program, and this Wednesday, the 22nd day of October in the year 2014. If you are just joining us, welcome. Our topic today is education. More specifically, at least in this hour, will be the education within the study of American history, United States history, and some of the changes taking place in the so-called AP, or Advanced Placement programs, in the way our high school teaches junior and senior students American history. We have a new phone number. We would love to hear from you. Our new phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N, 4676. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. We were looking at the proposal, or the explanation, if you will, for rethinking the teaching of American history. This comes from a report called the La Pietra Report, which was drafted at an Italian villa entitled La Pietra. And I think that it's an interesting aside that this particular villa is owned by New York University. And so the leadership for this whole project has pretty much devolved onto Professor Thomas Bender, who is a history professor at NYU, at New York University. He's the one that put together the formal report. He's the one that chaired the group on the change, the framework change, in trying to make the teaching of American history much more global, much more international in the issues it raises, and the explanations it provides. We looked at a few of the relevant paragraphs in a section about rethinking the way we look at American history in this modern global age. And there's just one or two more paragraphs in this initial section that I'd like to share with you in order to give you an idea as to where the AP program is trying to go. And then we'll take a look at the framework itself and some of the criticisms of it. The first line in the next paragraph, I think, is something we could spend some time on. It reads this way: that the nation is historically made, not a natural or socially inherent unit, is today easily grasped by historians as well as by our students and the public. I ask you to think about that, because the language here suggests that this is self-evident. I would suggest to you that it's not as self-evident as perhaps it should be. Because the fact of the matter is there are many people who have insisted and continue to insist that America, the United States as a nation, is not a product of history. Rather, it's a product of some divine mission or divine creation. Key to the argument in defense of American exceptionalism is the idea that the United States of America did not come into existence the way other nations did, but it came into existence through some sort of divine intervention or divine action. And that, therefore, as part of its existence, the United States has assumed a mission in the world which is unlike no other nation ever in the history of the world. That's kind of what makes us exceptional, these people would argue. So I would suggest that the phraseology here, by saying that the nation is historically made, not natural or socially inherent unit, is today easily grasped by historians as well as by our students and the public. I'm not sure that that's as true and self-evident as the authors would like us to believe. But be that as it may, let's go on. Boundaries are increasingly understood as being relatively permeable, more like zones of contact than firm lines of division. There's a greater awareness that the people, institutions, and cultures of America are entangled in multiple narratives, both larger and smaller than the nation itself. And international history will, we think, make students and the public more fully aware of the presence in their lives of histories larger than the nation and smaller than the nation. It will also reveal various Americans being participants and even agents in a world larger than the United States. By recognizing the complexity of American relations and identities, both within the bounds of the nation and beyond it, one is better able to understand the lines of division or dimensions of otherness within and beyond the nation, as well as the sources of solidarities within and beyond the nation. While this approach seeks to contextualize the United States on a global scale, insofar as such a scale is pertinent to the questions at hand, it does not propose to subsume United States history under the umbrella of world or global history. In other words, now they're saying what they do not intend to do. They do not intend to lose American history as a discipline within the context of world history. We are not teaching people world history and the United States as being one of many nations. Rather, we continue to teach American history as a discipline, but as a discipline with a recognition that we are a nation in a world comprised of other nations. We would not have United States history erased, Rather, the aim is to deepen its contextualization and to extend the transnational relations of American history. And I really don't know whether we want to take too much more time. This actually goes on for 4 or 5 pages. But basically, I think what we've done already pretty much gives the idea of where this group of historians from all over the world believes that the teaching of United States history ought to go, and what it ought to do that it doesn't do now. The reactions to this have been extreme. And I invite you to go to the National Review, and the position paper that I have is dated August 25th, 2014. So basically, this is a paper that was written a little bit less than 2 months ago in response to the LaPietra report and to the revisions in the AP United States History exam that resulted from the LaPietra report. The author of this article in the National Review is Stanley Kurtz, and the title of his argument is How the College Board Politicized United States History. How the College Board Politicized United States History. I think the first thing we need to recognize before we look at the first word in the article is to recognize that United States history has already been politicized. And the College Board didn't do it. The College Board, in its exams, merely reflected a very politicized, very slanted, very narrow approach to American history, which was obviously political. We were making sure that our citizens learned, studied, and believed and worshipped the very things we wanted them to. And along with that, we were very conscious in excluding from the curriculum those ideas and those concerns and those issues and those complexities that we didn't want our students exposed to. Making that decision as to what to put in the curriculum and what to leave out of it is, I would suggest to you, a political decision from the very beginning. So to suggest that this particular reform movement introduced politics into the way we teach American history is absurd. And I think we need to recognize it before we go on to even into the article. And I think you also have to be aware of the rhetoric, the language here, because this article is filled with the kind of adjectives and adverbs and modifiers, if you will, that reflect a very, very particular political slant. I'll do the very best I can to point out some of them. The College Board, the private company that produces the SAT test and the various advanced placement exams, has kicked off a national controversy by issuing a new and unprecedentedly detailed framework for its AP U.S. history exam. This framework will effectively force American high schools to teach U.S. history from a leftist perspective. I think we need to pause there for a moment, because what Stanley Kurtz is saying here is that the global perspective, the international perspective, that really is what the new framework is all about, is here referred to as a leftist perspective. I think it's very, very important that we recognize that. What we are seeing here already is an issue which is beginning to raise its head, raise its visibility this early in the article. And that is that if you begin to introduce to students the idea that the United States of America is not the only nation on the face of the earth, but rather that it is one of a number of different nations and a number of different peoples who do not live within organized nations, as it were, then you are introducing a perspective which is leftist. Not one that is real, but one potentially that is threatening. To whom? I think that's the issue that we need to keep in mind. The College Board disclaims political intent, insisting that the new framework provides, quote, a balanced guide that merely helps to streamline the AP U.S. History course while enhancing teacher flexibility. Not only the framework itself, but the history of its development suggests that a balanced presentation of the American story was not the College Board's goal. The implication here is that there is an insidious attempt here in this reform to politicize American history by making it more leftist, more liberal, less conservative, less traditional. I would suggest to you, even at this point, that the issue here is not political versus non-political. It's traditional politicization versus revised or reformed politicization. Granted, it is political, but the implication that history, the teaching of history, was not political before is absurd, patently absurd. The origins of the AP U.S. History framework are closely tied to a movement of left-leaning historians that aims to internationalize the teaching of American history. The goal is to end American history as we have known it by substituting a more transnational narrative for the traditional account. Basically, then, the historians from the Organization of American Historians, the major professionals in the field who were involved in developing these reform guidelines, are all prisoners of leftists. I think there's a couple of things that we need to keep in mind here. And one of them is, as we work our way through this article, we've got to pause periodically in order to try to derive a definition of what they mean by leftist. Let me throw out a possibility at this early point, and we can test it in the rest of the article. I would suggest to you that what Stanley Kurtz means by leftist is thinking. I find concern with that, but I also find hope in that. Because what I see here is that in teaching students to think and how to analyze and how to evaluate and how to rank and how to judge, Stanley Kurtz believes that we're producing leftists. I believe we're producing educated citizens. Maybe, and I say this kind of tongue-in-cheek, maybe to be educated is to be a little bit left. And maybe to be right is to not be educated at all, but indoctrinated. And I would suggest to you that if that's true, then let me go left. But that's just, it's my own tongue-in-cheek comment. Stanley Kurtz goes on, this movement's goals are clearly political and include a promotion of an American foreign policy that eschews the unilateral use of force. I need to repeat that sentence because I think it is so unbelievably astounding. This movement's goals are clearly political and include the promotion of an American foreign policy that eschews the unilateral use of force. Basically, what Stanley Kurtz is defending here is the American use of unilateral force. I would suggest to you, as an example of such unilateral force, the 2003 war in Iraq. And the situation that we face today in the Middle East, in ISIS, all of this, ISIS, Iraq, the overthrow of Mubarak in Egypt, and on and on and on, and the Israeli-Palestinian situation, all of it was kicked off, at least in part, by this unilateral action that the United States under President Bush decided to take in 2003. So to basically propose the teaching of history which would raise questions about these kinds of unilateral activities as being political and being leftist, I suggest to you, raises the question, by attacking what they are attacking, what is it they are saying they want to preserve? And once you begin to identify and define what it is they are afraid of losing, we can begin to understand how they define an educated citizenry. It's totally different than the way this report defines it. So that's the first major issue in this National Review piece that I would focus on. That because this movement's goals are political, we will lose the ability to exercise unilateral force in the world. Unilateral force is we do what we want to do because we define or feel the need to do it, irrespective of what the rest of the world thinks, wants, or anything else. That's what we're losing. And that's what Stanley Kurtz is arguing that we should not lose. He goes on, the movement to internationalize the U.S. history curriculum also seeks to produce a generation of Americans more amenable to working through the United Nations and various left-leaning non-governmental organizations on issues like the environment and nuclear proliferation. A willingness to use foreign law to interpret the U.S. Constitution is likewise encouraged. Think about all the criticisms, the basis of the criticism for internationalization of the Teaching American History course that Stanley Kurtz is opposed to. The United Nations is a left-leaning organization. And other left-leaning non-governmental organizations on issues like the environment and nuclear proliferation. In other words, what Kurtz is arguing for is the right of the United States to take unilateral action on world issues like the environment, the economy, climate. I would suggest to you that the track record that we're running on may not be one that defends his position all that much. Kurtz goes on to say that the new AP U.S. history framework clearly shows the imprint of the movement to denationalize American history. Before I trace the rise of this movement and its ties to the College Board, let's have a closer look at its goals, Kurtz says. Now we're into the La Pietra report. NYU historian Thomas Bender is the leading spokesman for the movement to internationalize the U.S. history curriculum at every educational level. The fullest and clearest statement of Bender's views can be found in his 2006 book, A Nation Among Nations, America's Place in World History. Bender, Kurtz says, is a thoroughgoing critic of American exceptionalism. The notion that America is freer and more democratic than any other nation, and for that reason a model vindicator, and at times the chief defender of ordered liberty and self-government in the world. I need to pause on that paragraph. Not so much on the title of Bender's book, A Nation Among Nations, America's Place in World History, because what Bender is arguing, obviously, in that book is a international view of American history. In other words, looking at American history as it unfolded within the world in which it exists, and the world in which it existed. I would like to focus our attention here on the last part of that particular paragraph about American exceptionalism. Bender is a thoroughgoing critic of American exceptionalism. The notion that America is freer and more democratic than any other nation, and for that reason a model vindicator, and at times the chief defender of ordered liberty and self-government in the world. The issue that I would like to raise is that that's not the definition of American exceptionalism that is most familiar to me. That's not the definition of American exceptionalism that bothers me. The definition of American exceptionalism that bothers me is the one that says that this nation is not a product of history, but rather is the product of some divine intervention, some divine vision, that God, in his ultimate wisdom, is going to create the ideal nation and give it the kind of ideal leadership necessary to become the model for reforming the world. That's the definition of American exceptionalism that I think gets us into trouble. This is a carefully worded, carefully conceived definition of American exceptionalism which is not real. But it's the one that Stanley Kurtz would like to defend, because all of us would like to believe that America is freer and more democratic than other nations, and that therefore, because of the respect for the individual that we have in our political system, therefore we ought to be a model to the rest of the world. and we ought to help the world move much more towards the idea of ordered liberty and self-government. That's what all of us are after. But that's not American exceptionalism. That's what he calls it here. But American exceptionalism goes way beyond that. And it basically argues that this mission is somehow divinely conceived and divinely inspired. And therefore, it comes fully equipped with rights and freedoms and ability to act independently from everybody else that is divinely inspired. American exceptionalism, as I hear it defined by those who believe in it, those who subscribe to it, is that because this nation, its structure and its mission come from God, therefore that gives us the right and the license to do whatever we want to do in the world, irrespective of what other people think or believe. That's the definition of American exceptionalism that this crowd supports. But that's not the definition of American exceptionalism that Stanley Kurtz chooses to put in here. Tell me that the College Board politicized the teaching of American history. Stanley Kurtz is politicizing the teaching of American history. He is using a definition of American exceptionalism that is bogus, because to be open and upfront with it would contradict the purpose for which he's writing this piece. This is what the conservative group that reads the National Review believes American exceptionalism is. But American exceptionalism, as we know, is a hell of a lot more than that. So much for the unilateral action, the unilateral use of force that would be in jeopardy with these new reforms. In opposition, then, Kurtz says, Bender wants to subordinate American identity to a cosmopolitan transnational sensibility. What does that mean? Bender wants to subordinate American identity to a cosmopolitan transnational sensibility. Bender urges us to see each nation, our own included, as but a province among the provinces that make up the world. Whereas the old U.S. history forged a shared identity by emphasizing America's distinctiveness, Bender hopes to encourage cosmopolitanism by internationalizing the American story. I would suggest to you that the American story is an international story. We are a nation of immigrants. It is bizarrely absurd to argue or to believe for a moment that American history, that the United States of America came into existence in any other way but as the part of the historical process of nation building. It is international and commercial interaction with the rest of the world that make this nation what it is. It is the people who came here from all over the world, including those who came here against their will, and on whose back much of this nation was built, that are the reasons that the United States came into existence. Not some divinely inspired decision the existence of which empowers certain people to believe that they have unrestricted, unlimited liberties to do with the world whatever they want, because our existence, our survival, our prosperity, our growth, our strength our infallibility is all that matters. The rest of the world merely becomes the supporting cast to the development of this exceptional creation called the United States of America. That is absurd. It is unreal, and we cannot continue to ask our young people to believe it, because the reality is that performance on tests is indicating that they don't. They're not buying this. As the expression goes, they're voting with their feet. They're quitting school. They're taking positions against education. They're claiming that we don't even need a college education anymore. What are we doing? And here is Stanley Kurtz trying to defend what we're doing. In the face of change. Kurtz goes on in his attack on Thomas Bender. Bender laments that history as taught in our schools has bred an acceptance of the nation as the dominant form of human solidarity. The growing focus on gender, race, and ethnicity is welcome, says Bender, but does little to transform an underlying historical narrative built around the nation. Even the rise of world history in the schools has backfired, Bender maintains, by making it appear as though American history and world history are somehow different topics. And what, in effect, what Kurtz is saying is that traditionally American history has been taught as if it functions independently of the history around us, the history of the world around us. Bender worries, however, that his globalizing approach to American history might be used to defend precisely the sorts of hegemonic American foreign policy he absorbs. To prevent this, Bender urges that American history be taught not only from an American point of view, but from the perspective of those who are subject to American power. Quote, Americans have always found it difficult to imagine themselves as an enemy, as a problem for other people, Bender writes. By showing us ourselves through our enemy's eyes, Bender hopes to promote humbler and more collaborative forms of American foreign policy. In other words, Bender's goal is to find a way for America to get along better with the rest of the world, and this worries Stanley Kurtz. Bender complains about George W. Bush-era foreign policy, not only in respect to war, but also in matters of environment, trade, nuclear, and other policies, unquote. Clearly, Kurtz says, he hopes that his anti-exceptionalist vision of American history will encourage a different approach to foreign affairs. Bender openly hopes that citizens exposed to a less national version of American history will sympathize with Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's willingness to use foreign law to interpret the U.S. Constitution, rather than with Justice Antonin Scalia's rejection of foreign law as an arbiter of American jurisprudence. So the fact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg will go to common law and to the laws of the world in order to evaluate the constitutionality of legislation that we're considering or have passed worries Stanley Kurtz. And he obviously is much more comfortable with Justice Scalia's idea that the interpretation of American constitutionalism needs to happen not only within the United States, but within the 18th century. And I think we've been there and done that. To understand the deep entanglement of the College Board in Bender's political and intellectual project, we need to return to 2000, when a group of 78 historians under the auspices of the Organization of American Historians, issued the flagship document of the movement to internationalize American history, the LaPietra Report, which is the report that we opened today's program with. The LaPietra Report makes much of the fact that those meetings were held outside the United States, and that nearly a third of the scholars working to forge a new U.S. history curriculum were non-Americans. One such scholar, in fact, was Cuban. Think about that. Francesca Lopez Severa, the University of Havana, participated in absentia, sending a paper on American power as an object of fear in Cuban historiography. That fits squarely into the central theme of the LaPietra Report, Kurtz says, which urges American students be exposed to the evidence of the controversial power and presence of the United States beyond our borders, to the point where one's native land seems foreign. So basically what Kurtz is criticizing here is the fact that something less than 1/3 of the historians involved in drafting the LaPietra Report were non-Americans. Basically, what Kurtz is arguing for is an effort to look at America's role in the world without getting involved with the people who live in that world. In other words, to write about the optimum involvement of the United States in a global world, in a global economy, if you will, in a global environment, but at the same time not ask the people who are being directly affected by the kind of power that we exercise unilaterally in that world. I would suggest to you it is advocating anti-intellectual research. It is suggesting that the product produced is directly results from the people who produced it, and that ought to be true. That the quality of the report is strengthened or lessened by who helps put it together. The quality of the Common Core is to be determined by whose money promotes it. And the document itself is not to be read and evaluated independently of where it came from or who produced it. That's what we're arguing for. We are arguing for the kind of research in order to address a problem and to accumulate or to collect the data in solving a problem that must come from only one source. Stanley Kurtz, inadvertently, I would suggest that he obviously is not doing this intentionally, he doesn't even realize he's doing it, is conducting illicit, invalid research. Because the only evidence of value, he says, is evidence that comes from the way we view our role in the world, and it cannot include the way other people view our role in the world. I would suggest to you that that kind of slanted one-way mirror in looking at the world is in part what has gotten into some of the issues and scrapes that we've gotten into internationally. The reason that nation building has become such a controversial item in American foreign policy is exactly because we continually insisted on operating with blinders on and ignoring what the rest of the world thought about us and what we were doing, and acting solely on the assumption that because we want it, that's the thing we should do. The only way to defend that is to believe that the rest of the world must accept the fact that we are really exceptional and we are not answerable to anybody. In 2002, 2 years after the appearance of the La Pietra report, a collection of representative papers from the La Pietra conference was published with Binder as its editor, and out of that publication came in 2003 the formation of a joint Organization of American Historians AP Advisory Board on the teaching of the U.S. History Surveys course. And out of this, in 2003, came the revised framework for the advanced placement class. A few examples, because we're moving rapidly towards the end of our time. Offering an alternative transnational history designed to combat American unilateralism, Bender says that Columbus and his successors didn't discover America so much as they discovered the ocean world, a new global community united by the oceans. The oceans, in turn, made possible the slave trade and the birth of modern capitalism, which improved the lives of Europeans but brought exploitation and tragic injustice to the rest of the world. Bender concludes that early American history is only partially about utopian dreams of opportunity or escape. The beginnings of the American story, says Bender, are deeply rooted in the birth of capitalism and the capture, constraint, and exploitation that this implies. And this, says Kurtz, is leftist stuff. By looking at the international considerations that contributed to the birth of the United States, you are introducing students to leftist perspectives, which basically suggests that you don't want them to even know about those circumstances and those considerations. Therefore, you are not educating students, you are indoctrinating students. You are politicizing students, which raises serious questions about the very title of this article. Because the College Board didn't politicize the teaching of United States history. The right did, and continues to. One of the things that Kurtz takes issue with in the article, and I'm moving rather quickly here because I want to get to the end of it. One of the things that Kurtz takes issue to is the use of the term migration. And he's very disturbed because Bender's report, the La Pietra report, talks about the migration of peoples rather than the term immigration. When we talk about immigration, when we write United States history and talk about immigrants, we are pretty much emphasizing the places to which they migrate, us, the United States. But when you talk about migration, you're talking about people that move from place to place, sometimes here, sometimes away from here. And Kurtz believes that demeans the significance of the United States as a recipient of migrants. So he's very adamant in his opposition to Bender's use of migration in place of the term immigration. And finally, and this is the last paragraph of the review in the National Review. Kurtz concludes by saying the following: "It is true, of course, that as on much else, Americans are divided about how best to teach and understand United States history. This is precisely why the new, lengthy, detailed AP U.S. History framework is such a bad idea. The brief 5-page conceptual guideline the framework replaced allowed sufficient flexibility for teachers to approach U.S. history from a wide variety of perspectives. Liberals, conservatives, and anyone in between could teach United States history their way and still see their students do well on the AP test. The College Board's new and vastly more detailed guidelines can only be interpreted as an attempt to hijack the teaching of United States history on behalf of a leftist political and ideological perspective. The College Board has drastically eroded the freedom of states, school districts, teachers, and parents to choose the history they teach their children. That is why this change must not stand. Again, the implication here is that cognitive thinking, analytical thinking, the ability to do honest research, and all those elements that we include in a definition of quality education are leftist to Stanley Kurtz and to the National Review. One must conclude that if you consider what it is that Kurtz is attacking, that leaves you a clear view of what it is that they are defending. What they are defending is an approach to education which does not work for most kids, but works only for the few. Namely, it helps us identify what Jefferson called the boy of best genius. Our current system of information-based learning, information-based reading, reading for information, not ideas, not understanding, not alternative or different perspectives, not context, but reading clearly for information to be memorized, has become a vehicle to allow some of the better and brighter students to surface, what Jefferson referred to as periodic skimmings of the cream of ability. This is what Stanley Kurtz and the National Review and those who are attacking these reforms are defending. They are defending an education that works only for the minority, because it produces a group of educated citizens who are deemed those and only those who are worthy to govern. And it renders the bulk of our population of students to the kind of education that does not allow them to participate actively and meaningfully in the society in which they exist. They become totally dependent on the philanthropy, the goodwill, and if you will, the Christian charity of those who are making money off of them. I would suggest to you that there is another way. Further, I would suggest that the preservation of the American Republic requires that we find another way. In a world of nations, in a world where many of the problems originate in the world at large and not within the United States, it is naive to believe that they can continue to be resolved or solved unilaterally by the United States. That's a dream. And to educate our young people to believe that is more than a disservice. It's an insult to the integrity and talent and abilities of our young people. And equally, in my mind, it's an insult to the founders of this nation who would be turning handstands in their graves if they heard some of this stuff. I believe that we are in for some interesting times. It is 59 minutes after the hour. We have reached the end of our time together for this, not only this day, but this week. This is Bill O'Brien inviting you to tune in again next Monday 1 p.m., for the next edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. In the meantime, enjoy and be safe. Thank you.